does that mean I shouldn't get paid for it? Well, there's this confusion about, what it means to sort of be generous with your emotions, to be friendly, to be human. If those very affects and aspects are the things that are being exploited in a job. And increasingly, we've been talking about jobs which purely depend upon affect, in a way. Okay, so there's discussion about work, decentering of wage work. But I think, again, this sort of trying to separate out work and sort of free time is very difficult because, again, I think this already has been co-opted. For example, in Britain, with the coalition government's emphasis on volunteer work and philanthropy, right? So part of their, otherwise meaningless idea of a big society, is that people should basically volunteer to do work for free that previously other people would have been paid for, right? So it's about, it's part of this wholesale destruction of public space and the welfare state. But what it means is that, in a way, it's very evil because it's playing on people's genuine desire to help other people, to be nice, to go and sit with old people and look after them and da-da-da. But it's, in a sense, precisely taking away those jobs from people who would have been paid to be nurses, care workers, and so on, right? I mean, it's not clear how successful it's going to be because, on the one hand, again, it's very contradictory. They're saying that everyone should be at work, but, people should also be volunteering and be philanthropic all the time, right? So it's not clear when anyone would ever have any time to do all of these things. But I think their model is so skewed by the fact that they are so rich and so in a different world that they don't really see this kind of contradiction. Like, we've got like 19 millionaires in the cabinet or something. And also, at one point, there were more men called Dave than there were women in the government, which says something about this sort of the class and androcentric composition of Britain's new ruling class, which looks very much like Britain's old ruling class. Basically, it's just old posh men from very rich families. Okay, she wants to empower citizens to use politics to tame markets and to fight for, quote, a new constellation of democratic powers that would challenge trans-border injustices. And I think here is, in a way, the limitation of Fraser's analysis, which is, in a sense, far too liberal. I mean, her critique of second-wave feminism, or, a critique of the way it was co-opted by neoliberalism, is quite convincing in some ways and very polemical as a claim. There are lots of feminists who would be outraged by this suggestion, I think. But in a way, her kind of proposals for solutions to this problem are limited, I think, by some of the things that she identifies second-wave feminism as criticising in the first place, which is an emphasis on, simple participation or representation in a kind of very limited political way. And she doesn't really return to a kind of class analysis at all. But when she's talking about trans-border injustices, I mean, to go back to this idea that second-wave feminism was anti-state in the sense that it wanted to link up the critique of the oppression of women across the world, which is undoubtedly true. And obviously much work has been done on this. I mean, precisely the way in which, how does the West survive, by basically stealing, and exploiting the labour of women in other parts of the world, particularly women and children often. Think of the ways in which, women from other parts of the world work as nannies and so on, often leaving their families behind to care for other families in the richer parts of the world, and so on. We have very complicated forms of hierarchy and asymmetry. Such that it's difficult to talk about kind of, let's say, an internationalist or globalist feminist project without first acknowledging all of those injustices. Nevertheless, Fraser's idea of the trans-border position, right? So how to challenge trans-border injustices. She says in the interview again, she talks about this need for this transnational, even global public sphere. Citing the massive opposition to the Iraq War in 2003 as a potential image of this idea, right, in the sense that protests broke out all over the world before the war even took place, which was historically very anomalous. The numbers involved were huge, etc., etc., etc. so she sees this as maybe an image of a figment of a transnational project, and maybe we could see this in relation to recent events in the Middle East and the use and the rise of social networking and so on. Maybe this is an image of a transborder subject or collective subject. But as we know, despite the mass protests and despite the transnational nature of this opposition to the war, it didn't make any fucking difference. Yeah, they went to war. It didn't stop. It didn't. They were not bothered. I mean, Tony Blair explicitly said at the time, "Oh, well, isn't it nice that you can protest? We're going to invade Iraq so that their people can go on protest, right? It's like you're demonstrating the very reason why we're going to bomb Iraq, right? To the protesters." If you see what I mean, and again, it's this idea, this idea of exporting freedom, right? Anyway, awful, right? So it's very problematic, this idea of this transnational public sphere. What would it mean as a positive project, not merely reactive and ineffective project? I think we need to talk about a new image of a collective subject. What would this mean? That would incorporate a feminist critique. Fraser finishes basically by calling for transnational institutions that will, quote, regulate markets and banking, though again it's extremely difficult to imagine bodies large enough and powerful enough to outstrip the unstable yet highly effective combination of financial institutions and states that will bail them out when necessary. So, I mean, when people talk about the free market, it's obviously, it isn't free in any real sense if, the banks are too big to fail. I have more respect for very hardline right-wing economists who say they should have failed, right? If they didn't work on market terms, they should have collapsed, right? But obviously now we have this kind of unstable combination of statism and globalized financial industry. To deal with this, I think maybe it looked like that was happening at some point, but obviously the recent financial crisis has, if anything, pointed out the resurgence of the state in defending and supporting financial and kind of huge industry. Okay, so that's I'll stop there, and that's about an hour, so we can have some discussion. And hopefully nothing will fall on my head. Do you want to share it, or should we just?
No. We can moderate this.
When we look at the country statistics, we do see that part-time employers are mostly women, and this is mostly a low-wage way of working, and this is still considered as a flexible way of working, and in some countries still taken as a flexible way of working, and it's still seen as a part of gender mainstreaming. I wonder what's the image of part-time working in England from government eye and also from gender perspective.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. I didn't mention part-time work, or I have discussed it elsewhere. I mean, I think the pattern is much the same elsewhere, although it's more vicious in certain places than others. But I mean, there are lots of things going on with part-time work. I mean, one of them is, of course, the relationship to parenting. In which the implicit idea is still that the burden of responsibility lies with the woman, right? So you have an image of family structure that's ideological in some sense. It's still there, right? So even if there's lip service paid to equality and people's ability to join the labour market on equal terms, right, very clearly this is revealed to be untrue when it comes to maternity. So we know that, for example, if women go into part-time work, if they've been working full-time, they very rarely ever get back to the position they were in before they had children. In places like Britain and elsewhere, there's not so much France. France has an interesting support system for maternity, but Britain, there's not much support, right? So childcare is extremely expensive, right? So even when women go back into work, they end up basically giving all their money to childcare because there's no sort of funding or and all of the benefits have basically been cut now as well. Part-time work is, again, part of this general what happens to work after the war, really. And lots of people have said that, in a way, the kind of work that women used to, or the way in which women's work was very insecure, precarious, badly paid, and so on, has basically come to be the image of work as a whole, right? So that basically there's no more, people are not supposed to expect any pension scheme, they're not supposed to expect any job security, any rights, really, just so so there's this kind of way in which part-time work is very much a part of this, and obviously people are working 2-3 jobs, and looking after children, and it's often women doing this kind of work. And obviously, again, part-time work, you can unionise if you're in part-time work, but it's based on a very different model of the worker than like the classic union, the person in the union who's like full-time, militant, works in a certain place, and so on. In relation to this, I forgot to mention, this, in terms of this rhetoric of forcing people back into work, even when they let's say have children, or in this case, if they're disabled. So basically, in Britain, they're cutting disability benefits. And there's a recent suggestion by a Conservative MP that people who are disabled should be prepared to work for less. Right, so we have a minimum wage, which is very low, it's really crap anyway. And he said, well, look, it's difficult to find these people jobs sometimes. They should be prepared to work for less than the minimum wage, which is probably one of the most offensive things anyone's ever said, ever. But it is very much part of this idea that, everyone should be seen as on equal terms entering the labour market. And if they're not, then screw them. They're their fault. The welfare state doesn't have any duty. Well, it's not really existing anymore, but the state has no duty to compensate for maternity or for people who can't work. Somehow the image is that you're forcing everyone to imagine themselves as childless, rational, able adults competing equally in the labour force. And this is obviously completely untrue. It doesn't bear any relation to people's lives. And I think, part-time work, we know that also not only is part-time work dominated by women, but it's also much, much worse paid, even if the hours were extended to full-time work. On the level of hourly pay, part-time work is incredibly badly paid. And again, I think part of this idea of branding and flexibility, part-time work is seen as, you can fit it around your life, it's sort of freedom for you, isn't it, rather than this image of like the full-time job in which, you're responsible and you have old-fashioned things like pensions and, do you know what I mean? So I think it is definitely part of the kind of ideology of a certain post-war vision of work.
It was very interesting that you had mentioned first. I read a report that was released last year about the payment, the gap, the wage gap between every country will